Without further ado, Dawna Ballard.
Thank you so much. I can't even tell you how excited I am to be here with this group today. The past several days has been nothing short of fantastic for me. So I want to contribute to this conversation a communication perspective. So as John mentioned, I study organizational communication at UT Austin. And most people don't know what that means. It essentially is that I study the messages and symbols that we use, and particularly around work and in our work, that shape and are shaped by human interaction. So time and the messages and symbols around time is the focus of my conversation today. And I call it finding time because part of the issue in taking back your time is being able to identify when the issues around time are coming up, and in fact, and to identify and be aware of how a hidden mythology, an industrial-based mythology, is still shaping us today. So in some cases, when we sort of lose touch, it's because we've forgotten or we haven't interrogated some of the more fundamental assumptions. And so in our short time together, I'll just briefly describe what this word means, chronemics, and then I'll describe some of those hidden assumptions, talk about some of the part of this industrial mythology. It's big, so I'll just mention 3 things briefly, and the related research that shows us that's actually not true, and then I intend to leave time to talk, so I'll try not to rush. I literally have been deleting slides as we go because in part things have already been addressed, and in part because I'm really interested in having a conversation with you. So chronemics is simply the study of time as it's bound to human communication. So it's the way that through our connections and with others and our relationships in any number of media, and communication media in particular has shifted a lot of that experience. I'm interested in that aspect of time as opposed to simply some objective, measurable experience of time. A cultural anthropologist, Edward Hall, called time the silent language. I wonder if I move, if you can still hear me. I'm feeling quite constrained. Yeah, I guess you won't be able to hear me. Okay. So the silent language, he called time the silent language because, one, it's a nonverbal code, but 2, most of what time and communicates and the way time speaks to us is really part of the tip of an iceberg. And so we know the basics, like we get the idea that our alarm clock tells us when to get up. So I want you to think about that literally time is communicating. It's literally a language. And so the challenge, though, is that most of that language is hidden. So what we have, rather than a language that we all are really proficient at speaking, we have a language that many of us don't even know how to truly speak. And the fact is that all cultures have these deeply hidden assumptions around time, which makes sense logistically. Like we can't on a daily basis go through like what are our basic assumptions around time and talk about that. For efficiency's sake, we just have these assumptions that we need to coordinate. But the problem with having hidden assumptions is that we don't know that they are there. And in fact, instead, rather than realizing, oh, this is my culture's view and construction of time, we confuse these assumptions for truth. And it's an unexamined truth at that. And so what I describe and talk about in my classes is the need for chronemic literacy, that if time is a silent language, I believe that we need to be able to speak that language. And unless we have a community And it's not always easy to find those communities. And I think one of the reasons I know the reason I'm so excited to be here is that you represent a community of people who are talking about all of these hidden assumptions, and you don't confuse them for truth. But developing and being good at any language means you need a community to talk with and to practice it and to regularly use it. So not like the French that I studied for 5 years or the Spanish that I don't use so much, and so I'm quite rusty. This is something we need to talk about regularly. And so I tend to move toward speaking plainly about when an issue is time-based versus some other work construction. So some of those hidden assumptions across time, and I'll talk about in the Industrial Revolution and before in since. So with industrial time, what we think time is and what we completely limit time to be is the clock. And that's what we think because there's all of those other hidden assumptions. But rather than time, or because we view time limited in this very limited way as being represented by a clock, which I'd like us to remember, we only have a couple centuries of this. This is not something that God delivered to us. This is a human invention, and yet we forget that fact because messages and symbols are so powerful and they become reconstructed in our daily use. And this is why I'm very sensitive to the language that I use around time and work. And so the clock makes us, because it's seen as it's the only thing we know about time, we tend to think then that people work a lot like machines because a clock essentially is a machine. It's actually a gravimeter. It really just measures gravity. Atomic clocks are a different story, and I can go into a lot of geeky communities and get really excited, and I recently was with a bunch of timekeepers, and so I could go off on a tangent there. But one of the biggest problems with the clock is that it gets us confused that all times are the same, and Robert mentioned this yesterday in his workshop. But if you look at a clock, right, all of the hours, they have different numbers, but they all essentially mean the same thing. There's 60 minutes, and they're defined in this very precise and segmented way, and it all looks the same. But we know as humans, from a communication standpoint, if your loved one calls you at 2 p.m. versus 2 a.m., that means something starkly different. We know that all times aren't the same, even when we're looking at the clock. But further, there's more. If you think about, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. And because of that, we get confused. So this all comes out of the Industrial Revolution, and this comes out of a model where I'll show you a picture in a minute, where we were looking at factory work, right? The clock, a precise mechanized timepiece was one of the engines that fueled the Industrial Revolution, along with electric lighting. But both of those things allowed us to control, or to have a sense that we could control the people and events around us, because in factory work, it's very controllable in some relative sense. And this is what we would call chronos time, and that is just one type of time, okay? In contrast, both prior to the Industrial Revolution and now, because we are clearly no longer in an industrial revolution, the event has always been how we viewed time. And so when you look at the way that industrial time had shifted our sense of how we operate and how we can relate to each other, when you think about events, it's totally different. So first, in both, let's think about agrarian work, right? Pre-industrial work. People worked nothing like machines. People didn't work around the clock. They might have gotten up early and they worked really, really hard. And I have my students read about agrarian work and the fact that we sometimes romanticize pre-industrial work as easy. Not easy at all, but it was event-based. So there were times when you were working really hard, and then there were times when you were resting. And that when we went into the factory and were able to control so many factors, we thought, well, we'll just work around the clock because we can. And we've taken that model that was meant simply for factory work, and we've imported it into post-industrial work. And it just doesn't, it's not effective. We're using a model that was not meant for the work we're doing today. We know that all times are not the same. We know that there's times and one of the things I'd like to talk about is from moving from mechanistic models to human and biological models. And so we know even for ourselves, when I saw that I was scheduled for 12 noon, I thought, and with people from so many different time zones, I'm like, oh my gosh, I wish I had food I would give out. So when I teach at 12:30, I just pay for and I bring snacks because we know all times are not the same. Our bodies are different at different times of the day. We have different levels of energy at different times of the day. And that's the same way that we work. And so we cannot work around the clock. And further, rather than us being able to control people and events, that life itself, our work itself, is through the people and events around us and the interruptions. And the challenge with interruptions is really only that we're using that model from an industrial mindset so that we are trying to, we're trying to extract the most time or the most productivity out of our time. But in pre-industrial and post-industrial work, the idea of interruption, there really wasn't a term for it or a conception of it. That was just people. That was just life. Things happen, and it's all part of the same context. But when we move from thinking of work as sort of an event-based activity and a clock-based activity, then that's when the stress comes. And then also today's interruptions are often free of context, so people don't see what's happening, and so that's a whole other conversation. But this is the background or the hidden assumptions that I'd like to first share that then lead to the next set that I'd like to talk about. And this is what we call kairos. This is the idea that sort of time happens through us, and this is not simply, time isn't this sort of separate thing that we are fighting. We are part of time itself. And so these assumptions, the first set around in the Industrial Revolution, they give rise to three related myths. And I'd like to talk about the first two, help to build an example from some recent research about work-life balance. And so the first myth is that productivity is measured by the clock. Well, it makes a lot of sense that we would think that when you imagine, this is from the National Archives, a real photo of work in the factory. And the idea that productivity would be measured by the clock there in the day and age of scientific management makes a lot of sense. It was in some regards, but most of our work today cannot be measured by the clock. And so what I suggest, and I have some work that talks about time scale and temporal design, and that until you know what time scale you're interested in predicting to, you can't actually measure productivity. So are you interested in looking at like a year-long productivity? Are you interested in having your employees with you a long time, say for their career, or for at least, let's just say, for 2 years? Then that time scale and what makes someone productive And that time scale is different than if you were looking at a day or a week or a month. Those are all really different questions. And so before I talk about productivity with organizations, I always first ask, well, what's the time scale you're interested in? Because the answers that you'll get are very different based upon this frame. So that's the first industrial myth that doesn't work anymore. This is the second one that I hear my students come to class originally saying, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. It's just not true. So there's early work from the 1920s in organizational theory, and it was based upon the human relations school of thought. So the early work in the classical school of management was the idea that people didn't enjoy work and that people found work objectionable, and so you'd have to trick them and threaten them was the most common way in the classical school of management to work. But in fact, the human relations school, through the Hawthorne studies, was one of the key movements or key developments in the human relations school of thought. People realized that, people love to work. We're actually hardwired to enjoy meaningful work, and that people don't find it objectionable. And in fact, that the happier people are, up to a point, they're more productive. So this idea of a happy worker as a good worker was born, and managers did try to manipulate satisfaction and happiness, and we can talk about the different definitions of happiness. That's, again, a whole other long conversation. All of this, which is why I'm leaving room at the end, can go in a lot of different directions. But so what I suggest is to be wary of language that tries to mask work as something else, because we actually naturally enjoy work. And there's nothing wrong with hard work. And I always tell people, and this works when people have kids, just think about parenting. I love my daughter. I would do anything for my daughter, but parenting her is work. So the idea that if I love something, it's not work is just, it's not useful. It also, the reason that it goes back to the industrial mythology is because it denies the human limitations to work, that there are just so much our bodies can take before we break down. So I really appreciate the ROI communication conversation, that there's only so much we can do. And I've seen this be used to abuse workers. I'm currently studying CPS workers in an ongoing grant. And I think that, the low pay in certain work is then traded for, but you love these kids, and isn't this so important? But there's human limits to work. So I really object when I hear people say that other myth. Now, the third one, I would say bear with me, because I know there's people in here who at first this might seem objectionable, but I'd like to spend the rest of the time just talking about a recent collaborative study where we found that actually focusing on work-life balance did not lead to greater well-being for our participants. And I'll tell you why. We found in a study it was a stratified sample where we looked at men and women, and we looked across socioeconomic groups. We looked at minimum wage earners, we looked at mid-range, middle sort of socioeconomic, middle-class people, and wealthier, more upper, mid to high socioeconomic group. And here's what we found. First of all, the low SES workers often didn't know what we were talking about. They were really confused about this, what? Work-life balance? What do you mean work-life balance? Does it make any sense? You work and you live, and why? And so that was some of the reaction. Then the other reaction was, Oh yeah, I've heard of that, but that was just for managers from the low SES. Like, oh yeah, that's for those other people. We don't get work-life balance. And so that's problematic alone. The fact that this term is used exclusively for certain socioeconomic groups, I think, is problematic. And again, here I'm speaking about language, not about underlying goals, but really about the language of work-life balance and what this means. And so what we did find when we talked to the middle class and the upper class workers was, and this is across gender, that they were heartbroken at their failure to be good work-life balancers. They had all heard the term, and they were often in tears in the interviews. They pounded their fist on the table. One quote, a woman was, this was often over a meal, pounded her fist and said, "This is not what I ordered." The idea that if they did it right, and these were all hardworking people who cared about both, and they felt like they personally, individually, had failed because somehow they're not able to be the perfect employee. We call that the ideal worker in organizational theory. They couldn't be the ideal worker and the perfect parent and the perfect spouse and the perfect family member, right, son or daughter. And it was like an albatross. They literally were in tears. And so part of the challenge that we found is that organizations, because they know that term sounds very worker-friendly, work-life balance, and so even my organization, they'll have a list of work-life policies, and they'll have, people come and speak about that it's a way of saying, here, we're creating all of the policies, right? So you have paternity and maternity leave, you have flex time, you have all of these great opportunities, and we're giving it to you. So now you go and figure it out. And by the way, that's your responsibility. But what the research shows, particularly some work by my colleagues, is that people don't often use a lot of these really great policies because you're seen as less committed as a result. And so everyone, because of the strong identity we place in our work, no one wants to be that person. So whether it's, during a period of layoffs that people feel actually worried, or whether it's simply that you don't feel like that is what a good or an ideal employee does, it becomes a problem. And so it really comes back to this issue of a shared issue, of a literacy that involves and requires a joint and a mutual conversation. And so one of the things I want to point out, though, that I think may contribute to this, it goes back to some early work by E.P. Thompson he wrote about the turn of the Industrial Revolution. He was a historian. And the idea of balance, it seems to, while bodies can balance, that's an important thing to have good balance, it seemed more to be associated with the industrial model, that there were two things that were work and life, right? So that here's a machine, a scale. There were these two things that you can pull apart and you could weigh them and you could see how well you measured up. And if that scale was even, then great, you had great balance. But in fact, the notion of work and life as separate terms, really, that only came with the Industrial Revolution. There was never a time before where the conversation even included this notion of work versus life, because there was really no need to. In fact, the only reason that distinction was originally created was because they were worried in the factories that these former farmers or at the birth of the Industrial Revolution, that people would take their full selves, their lives, into work with them. And at that time, work was all about simply contributing time. Work was de-skilled in factories, and it was literally, we just want your body here to do this work, and you go back home to your life later. So it was about professionalizing the workforce. And so my thought is that balance, when you think about the history of the conversation around work and life and separating it, is really maybe doesn't work as well for that reason. I think, however, even though I think that's one of the hidden assumptions, and again, this is, other than reading some historical work, there's no way to know for sure, but in our interviews, here's what people told us balance would feel more like. This is what they envisioned. This kind of balance. So they envisioned this serene experience of life where everything was magically managed and it was effortless and beautiful. And the fact is, life and work has never been effortless. It's beautiful, but it's never been effortless, right? It's work, like the whole of it. Life involves a lot of effort, and when employers envision or talk about, getting your own sort of work-life balance managed so that you can have that happy life, I think people think that, oh, well, I have all of these tools at my disposal. I should feel like this. And so the people in our study said that they thought it should be easier, that it should be managed far better than it was. And I feel like instead of this, what most people, when they think of balance and they think of these two things, work and life, I think it feels more like this to most people, that you're trying to balance on a tightrope where you have work in one hand, life in the other, and you are somehow supposed to go, across this tightrope and be able to gracefully do both, and that we find it really difficult. Or further, that for people like me and probably like you who don't really know where's just the work and where's just the life, it's something more like this, where there's more than just two things, and we are not sure how to avoid falling to our death. And so what we often do, and again, this is one of the challenges, I think, is that with the idea of balance, it's a binary. It's like you either have balance or you fall. Those are just those two things. And you fall. When you fall, we envision that you fall to your death. Like we are so identified and so intensely involved in our work that it does feel like we are going to die because of fight or flight. This is the new challenge is not killing an animal and surviving in that way. It's our work. It's succeeding in our work. So it really feels to us like it's either you succeed or you die. And so when we're crossing that tightrope with all of these things and not sure how we're going to manage, most of us decide, well, let's get some baggage off. And I may not be able to balance 6 balls, but I bet you I can pick one. So we throw 5 of those, and then I just hold work. And I think I can probably make it across this tightrope if I'm just holding work. And so that's one of the reasons that we don't talk about balance. We don't use that term in my class because it feels to a lot of people like something that they fail at. And also because we are still, if you think about the hidden assumptions, we're thinking about productivity, and that might even be work-life balance as a thing that we need to be productive at on a clock. And so it's a very short-term process. We're not really thinking long-term. And so I talk about alignment as another way of thinking about wellness, workplace wellness, so that something our bodies do, it's a cousin to balance, right? So actually alignment is what allows you to be like, if you look at an acrobat, their alignment is number 1, is like the key thing. And in that conversation, something happens with that language and that symbol. So one of the symbols you can think of is the body moving forward, right? So moving forward slowly or quickly, and whatever way you'd like to envision. But with alignment, it's about the positioning of multiple parts in relationship to other parts. And so the idea of our connections with others comes into play. So we have, right, the part of ourself that's a spouse and a parent and a member of a community and a child of someone and a professional and an activist. We have all of these different parts, and it's more about how they all fit together. The other thing about it is that every body looks different, and so we find alignment in starkly different ways depending upon what our body, like what our goals are. So in the sense of a body that actually is true, your center of gravity is going to be very different depending upon how tall you are, in any number of things.